Buñuel made Tristana in 1970. That was the year of its release. It was released in two versions, Spanish and French. And it had a bit of a checkered history because Buñuel had been interested in making the film back in the 1950s and had originally thought of casting in the main parts Ernesto Alonso and Silvia Pinal, two Mexican actors. And eventually nothing came of that. And a bit later on, in the 1960s, Buñuel tried again, this time to make it in Spain. But because of all the scandal surrounding Viridiana, which was, of course, the Spanish entry at Cannes, and the decision by the censors, by the government, to withdraw the Spanish nationality, so to speak, of Viridiana, because of what were considered to be the blasphemous implications and scenes in that film. So permission was withdrawn from Buñuel to make Tristana in Spain. There were several other attempts to get that permission granted, and finally permission was granted in 1969 and the film was made. It was a co-production, a Franco-Italian and Spanish production. And of course the principal actors were now Catherine Deneuve, who had appeared in Belle de Jour, and Fernando Rey, who had also appeared in Viridiana, and was to go on to make a couple of other films with Buñuel, The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie and That Obscure Object of Desire. And Franco Nero, a very interesting actor to cast in the role of Horacio the painter. Franco Nero was somebody who'd had a long career in Italian films and had also made his name in the musical Camelot opposite Vanessa Redgrave. Well, the film was based on a novel by one of Spain's great realist novels of the late 19th century, Benito Pérez Galdós. It's the second of two films that Buñuel directly based on a novel of Galdós's. The first was Nazarín. Nazarín was made in Mexico with Francisco Rabal in the title role. And that film transposed the action from Madrid, 19th century Madrid, to contemporary Mexico, even though the protagonist was played by a Spanish actor, Francisco Rabal. The second film then is, the second film that's directly based on a Galdós novel is Tristana. But it's also arguable that Viridiana is loosely based on another of Galdós's novels, a novel called Alma. Buñuel was attracted to the novel Tristana largely because of the incident of the amputated leg that becomes such an important part of the narrative when Tristana is discovered to have a tumor in her leg and it has to be amputated, and this is substituted by a prosthetic limb. But the film also offered Buñuel an opportunity to go to Toledo and film on location Tristana. He says in his autobiography that Toledo was a city for which he had a great deal of affection, and he enjoyed going back there to shoot Tristana. Galdós's Tristana was set in the late 19th century in Madrid, and Buñuel's Tristana moves the story both chronologically and spatially to Toledo in the late 1920s and early 1930s. That's an interesting shift because on the one hand it corresponds to Buñuel's own memories of Toledo from that period. Buñuel, of course, was born with the century, 1900, so Garcilaso de la Vega, the 16th century Renaissance poet, one of Spain's greatest Renaissance poets, also lived and wrote. So all of that, I think, would be of interest to and familiar to Spanish audiences who would make connections, either consciously or unconsciously, between the film and the action of the film and these cultural resonances that I've just mentioned. But what is also very interesting in the way in which Toledo is filmed is that we get a sense of its claustrophobia. We get a sense of the narrowness, the constrained spaces, not only when so much of the film is shot in the interiors of Don Lope's house. So Toledo is used partly as a way of nostalgically reminiscing about the times that Buñuel had in his 20s and before he felt obliged to leave Spain after the fall of the Republic and the triumph of the nationalists led by Franco. And on the other hand, the wealth of cultural and political significance that the city has and would have had for Spanish audiences in the 1970s. But what makes this a Buñuel film? Well, the thing that first comes to one's mind is that once again Buñuel uses dreams in this film. He says in his autobiography that if he felt that that a film was running short, that it was not going to end up as a fully fledged narrative, he would stick in a dream. Right from the very start, Buñuel's films are dream obsessed, from Un Chien Andalou right to the very end of that obscure object of desire. But I suppose what happens is that whereas in the early stages of Un Chien Andalou and the earlier films, dreams are used in the convulsive moments, to use that familiar surrealist word, of surrealism. By the time you get to the 1970s, so much else has happened in the history of film and Buñuel's developing interest in all kinds of other traditions and possibilities in the art of filmmaking, that the sort of wildness of the use of dreams in earlier films has now subsided into a smoother transition from dream and reality. When one thinks of the way in which dreams are used in this film, perhaps the most interesting point to pick up on is how there's a very fluid movement from what appears to be reality to suddenly the opaque poetry of a dream sequence. So the illusion between reality of Tristana's being in the bell tower with the two friends and the dream, presumably what she sees, the severed head of her guardian Don Lope, has been a dream, is done seamlessly so that you don't know what is dream and what is reality, where the dream began, where reality ended. There are other moments in the film that repeat this pattern of unnerving the spectator so that we don't know where the overlaps of dream and reality are to be identified. And as far as that's concerned, it's the abiding interest of Buñuel in the world of the unconscious. Dreams for Freud were the royal road to the unconscious, and ever since Buñuel's embrace of surrealism back in the 1920s, when he read Freud, especially the interpretation of dreams and other texts of Freud's, dreams remain a constant way of not only experimenting with narrative film form for the remainder of throughout his career, but also as a means of exploring the impulses, the desires of his characters, and presumably the projection of his own interests and his own desires onto the characters that he created. At the heart of the film is another of Buñuel's obsessions, amour fou, the love that transforms the individual and crosses all kinds of boundaries, social, psychological, age. It's interesting that when Don Lope is treated as a buffoon, still wedded to outmoded and ridiculous conventions from the past. And I suppose that's one of the interesting features of the character of Don Lope, that he is this mass of contradictions, a mare's nest of contradictions. And that is something that very much corresponds to Buñuel's complex treatment of characters. That there is no kind of Manichaean division between good and evil characters. The characters that he brings to our attention, the main characters, that is to say, obviously, are full of the contradictions of ordinary human psychology beyond the screen. But in the amour fou that he he feels for Tristana, clearly a point is being made here about the treatment of women in the Spain of the 1920s. His riposte is a Spanish proverb: La mujer honrada, la pierna quebrada y en casa. The honourable woman has to have her leg broken and to remain at home. And of course this is a prophecy which will eventually come true, because Tristana's leg will be broken, but whether or not she's a mujer honrada, an honourable woman, in the sense that Don Lope means, remains to be seen. So, on the one hand, a libertine, an anti-clericalist, someone who believes in freedom, who flouts the laws and conventions of ordinary mainstream society. He tells Tristana that one should never marry, since marriage will lead to boredom and death. And there's that wonderful scene where he and Tristana are out, insists on being brought back home to live with Don Lope, the man that she professes to hate, and yet from whom she feels it impossible to be severed. There's something similar in the relationship that Buñuel develops in Le Journal d'une femme de chambre, the Diary of a Chambermaid, where again there's a sort of magnetic pull towards the man who is possibly a child killer by the Jean Moreau character in that film. And so here there's a sort of perverse embrace of the monstrous as represented by Don Lope, by the girl, the woman, whom he has now turned into a monster, and the two seem to be inseparable, that they're inseparably linked to each other. During the course of the development of the relationship, this love-hate relationship between these two characters, Buñuel raises all kinds of interesting, perhaps Freud-inspired questions about the ways in which women are regarded as monstrous by men because of their ability to overwhelm and even devour. That, again, Freud-inspired desire to make safe the threat of women by fetishizing them in some way or another, controlling them in some way or another. And there's that struggle then between awe and envy that characterizes the desire of the male for the female, that leads to the sorts of Freud-inspired imagery, the severed head in particular, that is so potent in this film. Is the woman to be controlled in this way by thinking of her as an avenger, as a kind of Judith figure, severing the head of her Holofernes, in this case Don Lope Garrido, a castrator who must in some ways be controlled and constrained in order for her powers to be curtailed. Now those are the questions which I think the film invites the audience to ponder, and they are, of course, inspired by Freudian and post-Freudian discussions of male and female relations and sexuality. Tristana returns to Don Lope and abandons her young lover, Horacio. The abandonment of the lover tells us something about the strength of the attraction of Tristana towards the man who has been responsible for her unhappiness, and yet there is something that binds them together. They are both a mass of contradictions. There's an overlap between repression and desire in the relationship between these two, and that is the complexity of Buñuel's exploration of the theme of the relations between the sexes. But Horatio has another function as well, that the material, the subject, the range of interests of the reality that the artist seeks to capture is eternally beyond the control of the artist, whether it's a painter, Horatio, or a filmmaker, Luis Buñuel.